the song she never heard. 3 weeks after the night at the Crocodile Cafe, Kurt Cobain sat alone in his Aberdeen childhood bedroom, holding a cassette tape that shouldn't exist. The house was exactly as his mother had left it. Same faded floral wallpaper, same creaky wooden floors, same smell of vanilla candles and old books. Kurt had avoided coming back here since the funeral, but something about that night at the club, the breakdown, the song, the way the crowd had sung "You Are My Sunshine" with voices that sounded like prayers, had pulled him home. He'd found the tape in his mother's jewelry box, tucked between her wedding ring and a photo of Kurt at age 7, gap-toothed and holding his first guitar. The cassette was labeled in Wendy's careful handwriting, "For Kurt, when you're ready to listen." His hands trembled as he slid it into the old boombox on his desk, the same one he'd used to record his earliest song attempts as a teenager. The plastic was warm from the afternoon sun streaming through his bedroom window, and for a moment Kurt could almost pretend he was 17 again, waiting for his mother to call him down for dinner. The tape clicked, whirred, and then his mother's voice filled the room like a ghost made of sound. "Hi, sweetheart. If you're listening to this, it means I'm not there to tell you these things in person anymore." Kurt's breath caught in his throat. When had she recorded this? Her voice sounded tired but determined, the way it had during her final weeks, when every word required effort. But she refused to stop talking, as if she could save up enough conversations to last him a lifetime. "I know you're angry with me for dying. I know you think you should have been here, should have called more, should have been a better son. But Kurt, honey, you need to understand something. You were the best son I could have asked for." The tape crackled slightly, and Kurt could hear her adjusting the microphone, probably the same handheld recorder she'd used to tape his school concerts. "I've been thinking about all the things I never got to tell you, all the conversations we'll never have. But then I realized we've been having the most important conversation your whole life. It's been happening in your music." Kurt wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, remembering how she used to sit in the back row at his early shows, trying to understand the noise her son was making, trying to find the melody in the chaos. "Every song you've ever written has been a letter to me, Kurt, even the angry ones, especially the angry ones. You think I didn't understand your music, but I understood it perfectly. It was your way of telling me how much it hurt to be alive sometimes. And I heard every word." The recording paused, and Kurt could hear her crying softly. He'd never heard his mother cry before. Through all the fights with his father, all the money troubles, all the nights she worked double shifts just to keep food on the table, Wendy Cobain had never let her son see her breakdown. "There's something I need to tell you about the night you were born. You came 3 weeks early, right in the middle of a thunderstorm. The power was out in the whole neighborhood, and the hospital was running on generators. But when you finally arrived, the lights came back on. The nurse said she'd never seen anything like it. This tiny baby with a voice loud enough to wake the dead, screaming his lungs out, while the electricity flickered back to life all around him." Kurt smiled through his tears. She'd never told him that story. "I knew right then that you were going to be someone special, not famous. I never cared about that. But someone who could make light in dark places, someone who could take all that pain and turn it into something beautiful." The tape continued, and Wendy's voice grew stronger, more certain. I want you to know that I've heard the song you haven't written yet, the one that's been living inside you since you were 7 years old, afraid of the dark and crawling into my bed during thunderstorms. It's a song about forgiveness, Kurt, about forgiving yourself for being human, about understanding that love doesn't require perfection. Kurt's chest tightened. How could she know about a song that didn't exist? How could she describe something he'd never even attempted to write? I know you think I'm disappointed in you somehow, for the drugs, for the sadness, for all the ways you've tried to numb the hurt. But, sweetheart, I'm not disappointed. I'm proud, because you kept feeling everything, even when it would have been easier to stop. You turned your pain into music that helps other people feel less alone. That's not a failure, Kurt. That's a miracle. The bedroom felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, but not in a threatening way. More like being wrapped in a blanket, held safe while something important was being said. There's a guitar in the closet, your grandmother's old acoustic, the one I never let you touch because I was afraid you'd break it. But it's yours now. It's been waiting for you to come home and play the song you've been saving. Kurt looked toward his closet door, which stood slightly ajar. He'd never seen any guitar in there, but then again, he'd never really looked. As a kid, he'd been forbidden from even opening that closet. It was where his mother kept her most precious things. The song is about coming home, Kurt. Not to this house, but to yourself, to the part of you that remembers being loved before you learned to doubt it, before you decided you weren't worth saving. The tape was nearly finished. Kurt could hear the mechanical whirring that meant it was approaching the end of the reel. I'm going to ask you to do something for me, and I know it's going to be hard. I want you to forgive me for leaving you, not because I chose to. We both know cancer doesn't give anyone a choice, but for all the ways I failed you while I was here, for the times I didn't understand your sadness, for the times I tried to fix you instead of just loving you exactly as you were. Kurt shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. There was nothing to forgive. There had never been anything to forgive. And then, when you're ready, I want you to forgive yourself for not calling enough, for not being here, for being human instead of perfect. Because, Kurt, my beautiful boy, you were never supposed to be perfect. You were just supposed to be you. The tape clicked off, leaving Kurt alone with the silence and the late afternoon sunlight and the overwhelming presence of his mother's love, which somehow felt more real now than it had when she was alive. He walked to the closet and opened the door fully. There, behind a rack of his mother's old dresses, was an acoustic guitar case he'd never seen before. The case was worn and covered in travel stickers from places his family had never been: Nashville, Austin, the Grand Ole Opry. Kurt lifted the case carefully and set it on his bed. The latches were old and stiff, but they opened with a satisfying click. Inside was the most beautiful guitar he'd ever seen, a 1950s Martin D28, the wood aged to a perfect honey color, the strings gleaming like they'd been changed yesterday. Tucked under the strings was a folded piece of paper. Kurt opened it with shaking hands. This was my father's guitar. He played it every night after work, sitting on the front porch, singing old country songs to anyone who would listen. I sold it after he died because I thought keeping it would make missing him worse. I was wrong. Music doesn't make grief harder, Kurt. It makes love louder. This guitar has been waiting 60 years for someone who could make it sing the way it was meant to. I think that someone is you. Play the song you've been saving. I'll be listening. Love always, Mom. Kurt picked up the guitar, surprised by how light it felt in his hands. The neck was smooth and warm, worn by decades of loving use. He strummed a gentle chord, and the sound that emerged was unlike anything he'd ever heard from his electric guitars, rich and full and somehow alive, like the instrument had been dreaming of this moment. His fingers found a melody he'd never played before, but which felt ancient and familiar, like a lullaby he'd known since birth. The song that emerged wasn't grunge, wasn't alternative, wasn't any genre that had a name. It was just truth set to music, a song about sons and mothers, about love that survives death, about the way forgiveness can grow in the space where resentment used to live. He sang softly, his voice rougher and more honest than it had ever been on any album. She said, "Love doesn't end when people do. It just learns to sing in a different key, and I've been carrying her melody. In every song I never knew was meant for you. Mom, I'm finally coming home." The words poured out of him like water from a broken dam, carrying years of grief and guilt and gratitude with them. Outside his window, the Seattle sky was turning that particular shade of gold that happens just before sunset, and Kurt could swear he heard another voice, harmonizing with his, soft and familiar and infinitely patient. When the song ended, Kurt sat in the gathering dusk, holding his grandfather's guitar and feeling more like himself than he had in months. The tape recorder sat silent on his desk, but he could still feel his mother's presence in the room, not as a ghost or a vision, but as something deeper. A truth he'd always carried but never quite believed. That he was loved completely, exactly as he was. He played the song again, and then again, each time discovering new verses, new bridges, new ways to say the things he'd never been able to say. By the time full darkness fell, Kurt had written the most honest song of his life. A song about coming home to yourself, about letting yourself be forgiven, about understanding that love really doesn't end when people do. It just learns to sing in a different key. The next morning, Kurt drove back to Seattle with the Martin D-28 in his passenger's seat and his mother's tape in his jacket pocket. He had a song to share with the world, not the angry, distorted anthems that had made him famous, but something quieter and infinitely more powerful. A song about the conversation that never ends between parents and children, between the living and the dead, between the parts of ourselves that hurt and the parts that heal. A song she'd helped him write, even though she'd never heard it. But somehow, Kurt knew she was listening. The acoustic ballad Coming Home became Kurt Cobain's final recorded song, released 6 months later as a solo track. It featured only his voice and his grandfather's Martin guitar, recorded in a single take in his Aberdeen childhood bedroom. The song reached #1 in 12 countries, not because of its production value or marketing campaign, but because it spoke to something universal. The human need to be forgiven, to be accepted, to be loved despite our flaws. Kurt never spoke publicly about the cassette tape or the guitar, but close friends noticed a change in him after that trip home. He seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of his own sadness. He started calling old friends more often. He began talking about the future with something that looked remarkably like hope. The Martin D-28 became his most treasured possession, traveling with him to every concert, every recording session, every quiet moment, when he needed to remember who he was underneath all the noise. And sometimes, late at night in hotel rooms or backstages around the world, people would hear him playing softly, working out new melodies, new ways to turn pain into beauty, new verses to the conversation that never really ends. Because love doesn't end when people do. It just learns to sing in a different key.